Hello, and welcome to this special book launch event by the Bipartisan Policy Center. My name is Tevi Troy. I'm a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center and the director of the Presidential Leadership Initiative here at the BPC. The book today that we're launching is a special volume. I'll show it. It's the 21st Century Presidency, the Shifting 21st Century Presidency. It's a book about how the presidency has changed in this new century. This new century is almost a quarter gone. It's hard to believe. And over the course of these 20 plus years, we've had four people have the office of the presidency. George W. Bush, for whom I worked. You had Barack Obama. You had Donald Trump. You had Joe Biden. And each of those people has added to the powers of the presidency in discrete ways that, if you add them up, leads to a large expansion of what the role of the president is now. If we want to get into some specific examples, George W. Bush used signing statements in an aggressive way and also expanded the Homeland Security state. Barack Obama said that he had a pen and a phone presidency so that he could do things by executive order that he had previously said you could not do and could only do legislatively. Donald Trump had this vision of the unilateral presidency, and Joe Biden has both tried to use the legislative powers to create New Deal and LBJ style type expansions of government with decidedly not majorities of those size, but also he has tried to use executive authorities to do student loan forgiveness, for example, which is something which he's been rebuked by the courts for doing. So you add all those things together, and the next president, and we're not going to have a new president, it looks like, until 2029, but the next president is going to enter office in a situation in which the menu of options is much grander than the presidency that Bill Clinton left. So when Bill Clinton left office at the end of 2000, he had a smaller menu of things he could choose from. The new president in 2029 is going to have a bigger menu. What does that mean for us as a society, as a government, as a polity, as a constitutional republic? And when you start to have an expanded presidency, does that mean you have less Congress, less courts? Where does it fit within the whole separation of powers and the three different powers that are supposed to govern things? Where does the balance of power lie? So this book that I edited, 21st Century Presidency, is an exploration of that question. It has some essays by practitioners and theoreticians on the presidency. It has a number of panel discussion transcripts to discuss this question. And today, to talk about the book and to talk about these ideas, I have brought together two terrific thinkers on the presidency. First, we have Mack McLarty, Thomas Mack McLarty, who was the chief of staff in the Bill Clinton administration and has started a firm called McLarty Associates, a very successful businessman, terrific guy. Nobody I've ever met dislikes Mack McLarty. He's an amazing person. And I'll tell you one quick story. I began reading about Mack McLarty back when I was in graduate school at the University of Texas. And I have been reading about him for 30 plus years now. And I got to meet him one day, and I was so excited to meet him. And the first thing he said to me was, Tevi Troy, I love your stuff on the presidency. I couldn't believe that Mack McLarty was reading me, even as I've been reading about him for all these years. So Mack McLarty is the first person we're going to have on the panel. Thank you, Mack, for joining us.
Dr. Troy, it's my pleasure and privilege to be with you. Congratulations on this latest effort. You've got another one right behind it. So you're keeping up your prolific pace and important, strong voice in these times. So I'm always pleased also to work with the Bipartisan Policy Center. It's a great organization. I think the beginning clip captured it well. And I'm very pleased to be here with Ron Christie, who I have admired for years. He's a model of civility and serious thinking and getting things done in the right way. And he continues to be a strong and clear voice as you do. So I'm delighted to be here.
Great. I'm glad you mentioned Ron, because here he is. Ron Christie is the third member of this conversation. Ron Christie is a co-conspirative mind from the George W. Bush days. We worked very closely together in the Bush White House, and we would sneak off and have coffee or lunch together and talk about what was going on and how we could promote the agenda that we were trying to push forward. And he is very thoughtful. He's worked on the Hill. He's worked in the White House. He teaches at Georgetown and Cornell. and he's also got his own consulting gig as well, and always has something interesting to say. He goes on TV a lot. In fact, one time I was at Union Station with him, and one of the homeless people at Union Station recognized him. So I could say that Ron Christie is universally recognized as an expert on the presidency. So welcome, Ron.
Thank you, Tevi. And let me just echo Mack's comments. It's an honor and a privilege to be here with you both. As a member of the board of directors of the Bipartisan Policy Center, this is just yet another illustration of how important it is to have intelligent, thoughtful dialogue, not argumentative, but still we can be bipartisan. And I just love the fact that I'm on with Mack McLarty. We might come on with different viewpoints, but it always seems that every time that Mack and I talk together, we're on the same wavelength and we are always seeking to come out with the right outcome. So one can be partisan in their orientation, but we can all strive together as Americans to do the right thing. So Tevi, we're thrilled to be here with you, and I am just ready for the conversation.
Thank you, Ron, for that. And I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your friendship. And I appreciate both of your friendships and both of your insights into the presidency. So we have this book, and I did not write it, but I did edit it. And when I was looking through it, it struck me that there's this very real concept in there that the presidency today is just very different from the presidency as it was when the two of you worked in the White House, especially Mack before the beginning of the 20th century, before the beginning of the 21st century. You were still a 20th century presidency that you worked for. And then Ron, when you worked for the Bush administration, it was only one of the four presidencies into this expansion of powers that I'm talking about in the book. I was just going to ask each of you, starting with Mack, what do you think of the thesis that the presidency today is just a much expanded entity than it was? And are you comfortable with that? But is it really something that was recognizable to you when you read the book?
Well, Tevi, I couldn't help but think when you mentioned about the 21st century, President Clinton, when he ran for re-election, one of his recurring themes was, would you help me build that bridge to the 21st century? And I would like to think that my friend of longstanding, President Clinton, was well suited for that transitional period following George H.W. Bush for his presidency. But there's no question, if you think about it, that the way you now conduct your affairs, your daily activities, are so dramatically different today than they were in the Clinton administration just prior to the turn of the century. I would say, however, Dr. Troy, that I don't think the premise of the presidency has fundamentally changed. I still think it is our chief executive officer, a person that's expected to be our leader in this country and our representative in our dealings in an international sense. I think the primary pillars of any presidency are the safety and security of the American people. That's the most sacred responsibility, which obviously after 9/11, President Bush 43 was confronted with that critical issue, and the prosperity of the American people. So I think that has been a through line since our beginning. What clearly has changed is the methods of communication have changed so dramatically. Bill Clinton got to the presidency without one single tweet. Now, I think Governor Clinton cut some new ground or forged some new ground going on television shows like Arsenio Hall and connecting with different constituencies, but that's quite different than the social media and the really difference in the cable channels, Fox was just beginning when we were starting the Clinton presidency. So all of that's changed dramatically. I think also, Tevi, that we see, at least at the moment, a real decrease in trust in institutions, and that would include the presidency. It would include other organizations. Even the military is down a bit from where it was. That has changed as well. Has the presidency expanded? The federal government, some of the statistics and some of the materials that Ron and I both reviewed, I mean, you just think about it. it was 7% of GDP. It's now 20%. You had 4 cabinet members. Now you have 15, 6 of which were created in recent years, and a workforce of 200,000 to 2.2 million. That has led in and of itself to an expansion of the presidency. And finally, I think the gridlock, dysfunctionality, call it what you would like, in the Congress has encouraged some of this, what you have properly deemed the expansion of presidential powers.
I think, Mac, you bring up some really interesting points, especially about the Congress ceding some of its authorities and allowing the president to step in, but also something that comes up in Ken Baer's very interesting essay in the 21st Century book about how the job of a White House staffer changes from an era when you had a pager to then you have a BlackBerry to then you have an iPhone to then you have a Twitter account. And that's something that Ron, I know you've put a lot of thought into. So Ron, can you talk about this question of the 21st century presidency, the expansion of powers, and the changing role of the White House staff in that context?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tevi. You know, I go all the way back to 1939, actually, and you looked at the executive office of the president was created by FDR via executive order, and something that we'll talk about in our time together today is the president's use of an executive order. But if you go from 1940 to 2024, each president really has had the opportunity to put his imprimatur on the office of the presidency itself, whether it was President Bush creating the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives or the USA Freedom Corps, President Clinton, of course, having a commission headed by the vice president of reinventing government. The thing that I would offer to the two of you and our audience for having worked as Vice President Cheney's deputy domestic policy advisor first before joining President Bush's White House staff is the evolution of the vice presidency. And really, ever since 1977, you have to go back and think this was the first vice president, Walter Mondale, who had an office in the West Wing of the White House, and how important the role of the vice presidency was to helping the president do everything, as Mac outlined, of the safeguarding of the American people, our economy, and negotiating with people around the world to make America the preeminent society that we are. But it's interesting that the use of the executive order power of the presidency in the 21st century has really been an implement for President Obama and his successors in office to go around a very gridlocked Congress in times where partisanship seems to be the norm and extending a hand across the aisle seems to be very rare, which is a very important conversation to have as we're heading into this new presidential election where we'll have 2 former presidents or 1 former president hoping to take out the current one.
Ron, I'm really glad you mentioned that issue of partisanship, and I think it's apt because we've now had in the 21st century, we've had 6 presidential terms. I mean, Biden's in the middle of the 6th one, and 3 of them have been Democratic terms. 3 of them have been Republican terms. Obviously, the upcoming election is going to determine whether we have 4 out of 7 Republican or 4 out of 7 Democrat. But these shifts have happened on the watch of both parties in equal amounts of time. And I'm wondering, first to Mac, do you see any partisan side to this expansion of the presidency? Do you think the partisanship matters or doesn't matter? I really take what you said about the premise of the presidency not changing. Both parties see the role of the presidency appropriately as protecting the nation. But does one party have more of an interest in expanding the powers of the presidency than the other? And have we seen that in these 3 terms from the Democrats and 3 terms from the Republicans?
I think, Dr. Troy, there's no question the partisanship and that extending to primary elections in both House and the Senate have given impetus. And really, I think the presidents in some cases have felt justified and absolutely a need to get something done that they cared deeply about, that was likely a fundamental tenet of what they ran on. And because it's been so difficult without a working majority in either body in the Congress to achieve the bipartisanship that we've seen with other administrations, including President Clinton's, we didn't always achieve it, but we did on many of the important matters, whether they be trade, welfare to work, and certainly on foreign policy issues. That is just changed dramatically, and that has clearly led to a much more assertive president in using executive orders or interpreting laws or bills in a particular way. And I think it's also led to some foreign policy decisions that heretofore would have had much more consultations with both houses of Congress. So I don't think there's any question about it, Tevi.
That's fascinating. Now, Ron, you you were known as a partisan guy in your time, having worked for a Republican member of Congress and then worked in a Republican White House in a somewhat contentious period. But now you're also on the board of the Bipartisan Policy Center, which, by the way, let me just say is hosting this event. And if you have any questions, you should post them in the chat. So, Ron, you've got to have these two different phases. Can you talk a little bit about, from those two different perspectives, how you see the partisan natures of the 21st century presidencies?
I can. I look back to the days when I worked on Capitol Hill, and I was the legislative director and senior advisor to then Congressman, then Governor John Kasich. And what did we do? We came together to find a way to balance the budget for the first time since 1969, and we did it with President Clinton. And it was interesting in the consultative nature of us getting this accomplished. Of the White House would come to us, we would go to the White House and have those conversations and forge consensus and come to an agreement. I remember distinctly being in the Oval Office with President Bush and then Senator Kennedy, and then Chairman of the House Education Committee, John Boehner. And President Bush said, "I'm not going to do No Child Left Behind unless I have bipartisan sign off on this legislation. In other words, you have to have a Democrat, you have to have a Republican pushing this." And I look at where we are in the 21st century and the challenges that the presidents, now 46, and subsequent presidents will have to encounter, as my friend Mack has just articulated, is the essence of partisanship itself. Like previously in the 20th century, we found a way to get it done. We found a way to bridge our differences and come to consensus. Not everyone got what they wanted. Some people felt they lost a little bit more than they wanted to give up, but legislation was moving. So the challenge for the new president in this 21st century, of which we're nearly a quarter elapsed, is how do you find a common ground? How do you find a hand? And the three of us certainly know it's much more difficult to be disagreeable with somebody that you like. Perhaps the best piece of advice I would give to a new president would be get outside of those who are in your party and make some new friends across the aisle to get things accomplished.
Yeah, it's interesting advice, but a lot of people tell presidents it's hard to make a new friend when you're in the White House, right? The best friends, and Mac can speak to this, are really the old friends, the people who you knew well before you came to the White House, because there's a level of trust built up before you were someone who had something to offer. So it's really hard to do that. Matt, can you talk about this concept of friendship in the White House and whether you can actually make new friends once you come to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
Yeah, I think it's a false choice. I think you need to do both. I think you're naturally going to treasure, covet, trust friends of long standing, people that have helped you develop your policies or help you get elected or help pass your particular issues during your time as governor or senator. That's just natural in politics or business or academia or life. On the other hand, politics is a game of addition, or should be. And certainly we tried to expand that base rather purposefully. And our thought was as follows. One, I do think President Clinton viewed, he was elected as president of the United States, of all the people of our country. But number two, as we expanded those relationships, even if we didn't get support, we at least, as Ron's already noted, we at least established a relationship, a personal relationship. That in and of itself made the opposition less strong, which was a real positive. So I think you have to do both. I do think it's interesting to note that one of the few bipartisan bodies that seems to work pretty well, not that they pass legislation or specific policies, but it's the National Governors Association.
Yeah.
That's a bipartisan effort. It's kind of a safe space. It was the only time I could get President Clinton to be precisely on time. He looked so forward to those meetings. He was always on time. And I would say, Dr. Troy, as you look around the country, there are examples of both Democrat and Republican governors today with divided legislatures. Now, admittedly, it's a microcosm, but Republican governors in blue states that have achieved real success and have a high approval rating, which we'll probably get to in one of the essays that Kristen Soltis Anderson wrote. So I think there are examples how you can broaden that support base, and obviously at the same time stay very close to those who brung you, as the old saying goes, your friends.
Yeah, before I go back to Ron, I just love, Mac, that you mentioned the idea about Clinton not being on time so well. And you have a terrific story that shows up in the book about kind of telling Clinton that he really needed to get his act together and be more on time. Do you want to tell that story before we go to Ron?
Well, you probably caught me at a weak moment, Tevi, during your interview with me. But I think that's been published before. I think with what I think really was the case is Governor Clinton, when he ran, I think perhaps engaging with people a little longer served him very well in the campaign. But then you make the transition to governing and being in the White House, and he indeed did not always run on time. So I think the story you're referring to is I went in the Oval Office in the afternoon. He was doing his mail there. It was just the two of us. And of course, we'd had a long-standing trusting relationship, and I thought this might be a good time to raise it. And I said, Mr. President, you gave such a brilliant speech. It was so perfectly organized. It was just impressive. I said, it occurred to me how someone could be that organized and eloquent and be so disorganized with his schedule. And the president had his half glasses on. He looked over it. I said, well, I see I made you mad. He said, oh, no, you just hurt my feelings. And so I think he at least got the point, did somewhat better, and he got progressively better. I think all presidents, as Ron, as you've seen and know, grow on the job. That's just part of it. Even if they are experienced, they grow on the job. That was certainly the case with President Clinton, and I think other presidents as well.
Yeah, but I think it's a great point that sometimes you just have to hurt the president's feelings because you have to tell him what's going on. I mean, that is the job as staff. Ron, when you were staff, did you have any moments where you looked at potential expansion of the powers of the presidency along the lines we're talking of, and you said, I'm going to speak up. Maybe we shouldn't be doing it this way, or maybe you were rethinking how the presidency, because when you're in the moment, you just want to get the job done, right? You're not necessarily thinking about the constitutional balance of powers and what the founders wanted. You just want to accomplish what needs to be accomplished. And so how did you handle that tension?
It was a pretty significant tension. And the one thing that comes to mind is meeting with the late Senator John McCain. And President Bush felt very strongly about passing legislation called the Citizen Service Act. And he wanted to expand the AmeriCorps programs. He wanted to expand the number of Peace Corps participants and allow those in the tragedy of 9/11 to serve their country. And we thought about maybe doing some of the items that the president wanted to do via executive order, and came back from the counsel's office and recognized that we actually had to get legislation and we had to negotiate. And the president asked me to go up and to ask Senator McCain to be a lead sponsor and to help for this. And for those of you in the audience who have not worked with Senator McCain, the late Senator McCain, he could be, shall we say, feisty at best. And I distinctly remember him saying, hell, Bush sent you up here to talk to me. Why isn't Bush talking to me? And I said, well, Senator, I think I'm the best you've got right now, and this is a presidential priority, and we want to work with the Congress rather than seeking to circumvent it via executive orders. And he kind of just looked at me and he's like, okay. And so we got his support. But the important aspect of the story is that presidents seek to expand their power via executive order or executive proclamations. But sometimes you got to roll up the sleeves and go to the Article 1 folks, the Congress, and ask for their support. And that was very instructive for me, particularly being 32 years old, of having to go up against a decorated war hero and to ask for his vote and his support. But he came around and was very instrumental in helping President Bush get many of those items accomplished in the Citizen Service Act.
Well, Ron, first of all, I'm glad you mentioned the audience, because if people have questions, they should post them in the chat. But I'm also glad you mentioned Senator McCain, As we all know, he was close friends with the late Senator Lieberman, whose passage we note this week. It's a very sad week. He died, unfortunately, before his time. And I heard this joke that the good news is that now that Senator Lieberman has passed, he's in the arms of a loving God. The bad news is that John McCain is up there giving him a what for. So I'm sure something like that is happening. Mac, do you have any thoughts on this point about how you handle the tension between wanting to get the job done, but also trying to keep a handle on the appropriate balance of powers?
Well, I think that's a tension that you deal with regularly in any White House, but you deal with it pretty regularly in other situations as well. I had, I think, the good fortune with President Clinton. He taught constitutional law at the University of Arkansas, so there was a kind of a specific understanding and respect for that. And I was trying to think back, knowing that we would be covering this area. I don't ever recall really having to or feeling like I had to weigh in heavily. I felt like the president was carefully considering those type of decisions, and I'd like to think he and we handled that reasonably well. But I think the whole notion of kind of restraint and prudence and care and purposefulness is just something you have to keep in perspective in the White House, because you're going so hard, as Ron's already noted, to try to get things done, but you have to just really try to show some really measure of restraint and thoughtfulness, that you just have to balance that. And I would say, just as a follow-up, that Senator Lieberman was kind of the example of that kind of considered thought. I had the great good fortune and privilege of working with Senator Lieberman when he helped establish the new Democrat movement, the Democratic Leadership Council. That's when I first met him in the late 80s, well before I came to Washington. And he was a modicum of someone with principle and integrity, as well as uncommonly good judgment. He leaves an enduring legacy. And he and John McCain, as evidenced by his endorsing John McCain for president and speaking at the Republican convention, obviously had a very close and deep friendship.
Yeah, and almost became a vice president under a vice presidential nominee under McCain.
Under Al Gore, yeah. Exactly.
Well, no, but I mean, McCain considered putting Lieberman.
Well, both sides, but of course, Rand is
right. So he would have been the rare person to be a vice presidential nominee in two different parties.
Right.
Lieberman joked that the Republican base spared him from losing two elections as vice president. So, but I'm glad you mentioned Clinton, because Clinton left office, even with some challenges, he left office pretty popular, and it's rare today to see a president with the approval ratings that Bill Clinton had when he left office. And you mentioned the Kristen Soltis Anderson paper. She talks about presidential approval ratings and how they've changed over time, and how it used to be you could have these high highs and low lows, and you could have a presidential approval rating in the 60s and 70s, and it wasn't unusual. Whereas today she calls low but steady more regular. And I think that has a real impact on the way a president approaches the job and approaches the task of reelection. Ron, do you have any thoughts on what that means, that we have these now sort of systemic lower approval ratings?
Sure. I think Kristen Soltis Anderson is a brilliant pollster, and she really has a very strong finger on the pulse of not only American politics, but the American presidency itself. And, you look back to the mid part of the 20th century, and you look at some of the presidents and how they took their message directly to the American people, and wanted to be popular. In fact, you can go all the way back to the turn of the century of Theodore Roosevelt and his really embracing the notion of going out and selling his policies personally. Where we find ourselves now in the 21st century, you've got micro-targeting, micro-voting, micro this, micro that presidents often seem to be looking at whether the dial is going up, whether the dial is going down. Our former boss, as you know, Tevi, President George W. Bush, he didn't care. I mean, he said, I'm not going to govern based on what the polls are telling me. I'm going to do what I think is right, because that's what the American people elected me to do. I look at President Clinton, and obviously he came into office very popular. I think he left office being very popular. and people resonated with him. And one of the items I think that is a detriment to both President Trump as well as President Biden is that they don't seem to be able to make the connection that we've seen in a Bush or a Clinton or previous presidents that I think is somewhat to their detriment in these very challenging, very demanding times. I think people want the comforter in chief as well as the commander in chief.
So
So
let me
please.
add just a comment to what Ron said, because I thought he said it very well, as is almost always the case. But one factor in this, the mood of the country, I think, is a couple of things that are in Anderson's piece. One, we've got a very divided country. We've got pretty divided congressional districts, so people are very concerned about getting primaried either way. So that lends itself to a floor, but also a ceiling. But you also, I think it'd be remiss not to note, I still feel that we're coming out of COVID here where people are just not quite as confident and sure-footed. And even if things are going pretty well, they just are not, just not as optimistic and hopeful about the future. And you can see that in the right track, wrong track poll. And that relates right directly to these approval ratings that we're speaking of.
Yeah, Mac, I'm glad you mentioned COVID because one of the questions came in from the YouTube chat, and it's really interesting. It says, how much of this phenomenon is based on external events rather than just the inherent personalities or desires of the presidents for expansion? So, Bush obviously engaged in some expansion due to 9/11, and then Trump, had to deal with COVID, and Obama had to deal with the economic collapse. So sometimes circumstances lead presidents to make decisions that expand the powers of the presidency that weren't necessarily what they ran on or what their initial governing philosophy would have driven them to. And obviously you served in it was a consequential president, but we didn't have any of the crises that we've had in the 21st century in the Clinton years. So how much of it do you think is related to this issue of external crises of the sort that Elaine Kmark talks about in her paper?
Well, we certainly at times felt like we were dealing with crisis, but by comparison to a 9/11 or a COVID or even the financial challenges of 2008, they probably were much milder. I do think stability is a big part of any presidency, but it is guided, as you appropriately note, by circumstances. I don't think there's any question that the Congress is more appropriately understanding of the executive branch having to take quicker action in certain areas. You've got cybersecurity, you've got all terrorism, you've got all of these issues. I think that has changed the landscape, Tevi, and some of the powers that the presidency has. The key, or not key, the key question is, what is the right balance of that, and where how does the president do that in a judicial, thoughtful, serious manner? I think that's really the open question. You raised that really throughout this latest effort, and you probably will write about it in the future.
Yeah, I probably will. Ron, since you worked in an administration that dealt with some of these crises, do you want to weigh in on this issue?
Sure. I think external factors really have a way of impacting a presidency in a manner that the incumbent never realized. If you look at Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, and the notion that we were going to have a civil war, and he suspended habeas corpus. You go to World War II, where you have a outbreak around the world, and you find the president decided to intern Japanese Americans in one of the most disgraceful acts, and at a time that he thought he was acting to preserve the Union in ways that I think that actually helped sort of pull us apart. And I remember distinctly on in the days after 9/11, that President Bush told us, those of us who were in the White House, that we were elected on domestic priorities. And now his entire administration henceforth would be dealing with domestic consequences. And it's the elasticity of changing external environments that I think impact the internal working dynamics of how a president and those advisors that are closest to him or her react to those situations and in ways that were never foreseen. And I had the privilege of doing that with Vice President Cheney as well as for President Bush. And, as Mac noted, President Clinton was a constitutional law professor in Arkansas. And it's so interesting looking at the static nature of a piece of paper or a document known as the Constitution. But how do you govern? How do you make decisions bound by that Constitution, bound by that document in ways that were perhaps never foreseen in the presidency?
Yeah, Ron, I'm glad you ended on that note because we got another external question, and it's asking really what we need to do to improve leadership in the 21st century, given these challenges that we faced and given that the powers of the presidency are continuing to expand. What should we want going forward from our leaders? I mean, it would be too much to expect anything different in 2025 because we've got two retreads running, I guess. But in 2029, do we want to see some bold vision of leadership? Do we want someone like Calvin Coolidge, who maybe was willing to constrain the powers of the presidency? What are the recommendations for going forward? Mac, do you want to start with that one?
Well, that's a big question, Dr. Troy. I think you might have made a little news there with retreads. I think we need to be careful there. But they are two well-known former sitting and former presidents for sure. I think, Tevi, there's cross currents here. I think on the one hand, we're seeing kind of the height of a divided electorate. Some of that's geography in our country, some of it's over issues or a combination thereof. But you're also seeing poll after poll that is so clearly favorable to some type of much better bipartisan effort to address and solve some of the problems before us, and a consistent demand, really, certainly a desire for some measure of unity. And we see that in everyday America. You look at any kind of crisis that occurs in our country, you'll see people coming together. You'll see it at a state level, as I've already noted. I think that's what people are wanting, but they are not getting that at present. We're seeing a very divided country, and that's amplified, and it's a changing of the presidency. It's amplified with communication and the way we receive our news, among other things. And it's amplified, as Ron and I were talking earlier, with the way we finance our elections, which we could talk about all afternoon, but won't. So those are all corrosive factors, I think, to our democracy that have to be understood, have to be managed, and have to be managed by the White House.
Thank you. I would just love to hear Ron Christie's vision for what we need to see in terms of improved leadership going forward.
Oh, I echo Mac's comments here. I think that we have gone away from a system where it wasn't the red jersey or the blue jersey, but it was the red, white, and blue. And the president recognized and understood that they were the president of all people, all Americans. And we have hit this hyper-partisan cycle that you've got to raise more money. You've got to have more fundraisers. You need to get your base out. I mean, when did we ever start talking about the base rather than the American people? And in order to return, I think, to the civility that we would all like to see, it's what is your vision? What are the policies that you would seek to enact on behalf of all of the American people, not some of them or a segment therein, not based on race, sex, ideology, et cetera, but on the betterment of the country? And I think people would take better note and measure of whoever the presidential candidate he or she might be, of here's someone who's articulated a vision as to why they should have the high honor, privilege, and opportunity to lead all 300 and, depending on the day, 35, 50 million of us. And I want to buy into that vision. But as long as we talk about the issues that divide us as opposed to the issues that bring us together, I sadly believe, Tevi, that this partisanship that we see is going to be around for a little bit more time to come.
Yeah, Ron, in your frustration, you suggest that there was perhaps a better era in the past. And I think this is a good lead-in to discussion of the kind of supplementary ebook that we're releasing here today, the 21st century, Shifting 21st Century Presidency in Historical Perspective. This book is going to be electronically distributed to all of you who signed up for today's session. And it has fascinating essays by historians Larry Haas and Amity Shlaes about two different presidents who might have viewed the 21st century presidency in different ways. Both the Kennedys, Haas is a former Democratic staffer in the Clinton administration, and then Amity Shlaes is a conservative historian who's written critical books about the New Deal and the Great Society. So their essays are both fascinating, but I think sometimes you do have to look to history. So going backward in order to look forward to see what are some of the answers we want from our leaders in the future. Mac, do you have any thoughts about lessons we can take from history or from that historical view?
Yeah, for sure. I thought the Shlaes book on Coolidge was really, or the Shlaes commentary was just superb. I had seen Governor Mitch Daniels' op-ed in the Washington Post that had some of the similar thoughts. And what it really underscored was a person who clearly had full check of his ambition, understood that he was serving as president to the American people, and took a very careful, measured approach about the limits of government and the limits of the presidency. And in doing so, as kind of a forerunner to perhaps President Eisenhower, who was my first president as a child growing up in a place called Hope, Arkansas, that brought forth a measure of stability and confidence. And I think we saw that in the Clinton presidency to some degree as the economy improved, as we started to reduce the deficit, and as people got to know President Clinton better on the world stage. There was just a sense of stability and confidence, and that led to better times. So I really thought that was just a splendid piece and a keen insight. I thought Haas made a couple of really good points, both in talking about the Kennedys. First of all, it's hard to believe 62 straight years that a Kennedy has been in a position of power. Mm-hmm. That is just that is historical. That's just unheard of. And of course, John Kennedy kind of helped define some of the modern presidency in terms of campaigning and going forward from there. But I thought Larry Haas also made a point that you sometimes feel things are never going to change. We're just never going to get out of this difficult situation. And yet they do over time. And he made the point, Ron, not unlike what we've been discussing, is there was a pretty large swath of the country that had more agreement than not on a fundamental group of issues, and that was not being able to be captured by either party or either candidate at the moment. I thought that those two essays that you encapsulated very well, Tevi, in your work and edited, I thought were keenly insightful and relevant to today and some of the issues we're facing.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Mac. Do you have some brief thoughts on this, Ron, and then I'll close us out?
I do. I look back to the first president, George Washington, and he did not like partisanship. He did not think the presidency should be about partisanship. And of course, you saw with the election of 1800 that we start getting into partisanship, and it has been something that has been with us for hundreds of years. And the only thing I would say is the way that we move forward constructively is remember our motto, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. And we are one people, we are one country, and we are so blessed to be living in it in this point in the 21st century.
Amen to that, Ron. That's very nice. It reminds me of something that Ronald Reagan used to say in his speeches, which is liberty binds us together. Remember, it's liberty that brings us together, not necessarily our race or our religion or our gender or our region, but the shared concept of liberty. And I think that's what the presidents are trying to protect. I mean, Mac rightly said that they're trying to protect the nation. It's a nation conceived in liberty that is what we are trying to protect by electing these people to be our leaders. So we have this book, The Shifting 21st Century Presidency. It is now released. I think you would all find it fascinating. I would like to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for all their good work in putting this event together. I'd also like to thank the Achilles and Bodman and the Sarah Scaife Foundations for their support for this project, especially Les Lankowski, who helped conceive of this idea. And I think all of you should look at this idea of what we want in a president, who we want to lead us, and how we want to govern ourselves going forward. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.